Well, good afternoon and welcome to H360 Live. My name is Dave Duplay. I'm joined here in the studio this afternoon with my friend, my colleague from Healthy h360, Miss Courtland Long. Courtland, how you doing today?
I'm very well, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing great. Did you have a nice Thanksgiving?
I did have a nice Thanksgiving. I didn't go home to Illinois, but I hung out with some friends here in the city. It was great.
Well, you're going home for Christmas, so now did you have a lot of turkey?
You know, I don't overdo it on the Thanksgiving food. I like it, but I'm not one of those people that like piles it 5 levels high. So I had like a pretty moderate amount of turkey. How was your Thanksgiving?
It was great, yeah. You know, I always donate some time down at a homeless shelter, so I did that, and it's always very exciting and rewarding for me. And
good.
yeah, it was a good day.
Oh, that's so nice.
You know, we have a great show for you today. We have Dr. Keith Flaherty coming into the studio. He is an oncologist. We're going to be talking about cancer and targeted treatment. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a real exciting show. But first, Courtland, as we always do, we have health tips.
Yes, we do have some really great health tips, and these are very aptly timed because this is the time of year where everybody is coughing, sneezing, sniffling. So these tips are really great for the cold and flu season.
Yeah, you know, you can't avoid it 100%, right? Especially, we live in New York, we take public transportation, we're on the subway, we're on the bus. Inevitably, you know, there's always kids, you know, sniffling and sneezing. And not only kids, I shouldn't target the children, right? There's some adults that you know, you got to watch out for too. But these health tips are great. And as you mentioned, you know, it's cold and flu season, and these tips are really timely. So I think you have the first tip for us.
I do. So tip number 1 is to wash your hands. I can't stress this enough. Wash your hands a lot. Wash them after you use the restroom, after you get out of the subway, after you get off the bus, when you come into work, before you eat a meal. Wash your hands. Now, it's really important to use warm, soapy water. It doesn't necessarily have to be antibacterial soap, because for some bacteria, it's strictly the mechanics of scrubbing your hands that's going to get the bacteria off. And be sure to wash your hands for the appropriate amount of time. So 20 seconds is a really good amount of time to wash your hands. And you don't necessarily have to count, but you know, if you have the ABCs and you sing it twice around, that's probably about 20 seconds.
Twice around the ABCs, and that's how you wash your hands, or maybe once if you say it backwards.
Yeah, that would definitely be.
Because you have to think a little bit, right?
Yeah, you do have to
think. So now, Courtland, you know, I have very sensitive skin, and in the wintertime, and I'm sure people at home are wondering, I'm going to wash my hands, I'm going to soak, my hands are going to get dry, right? So what can we do about that?
Well, I have lotion with me like almost everywhere I go. I get really dry skin, and it annoys me, so I always have lotion on my desk. I suggest using some lotion after you wash your hands.
Well, is that an offer? I think I'm going to take it up, and I'm going to start using the lotion on your desk. That's very good.
Right.
So tip number 2 here is avoid getting close to people who are already sick. And again, you're riding the subway, we're riding the train, we're coming in constant contact with people. You know, that's easier said than done. But if you see somebody on the train or, you know, on the subway and they seem to be sick, you know, kind of stay away. If you see that they're coughing and sneezing and then they're grabbing the handheld or the railing to hold on, you know, you might want to avoid touching that as well. So really stay clear. You know, be aware of your surroundings, stay clear of those people.
Well, to piggyback off that, also, you can use those surgical masks to protect yourself when you're out in public so you don't get sneezed on the face like happened to me once in the subway. That was pretty gross.
Yeah. Well, you know, I do see a lot more people with those masks on these days, right?
Yeah.
You used to see you went out here or there, but now, you know, I ride the subway or the bus and I see quite a few people wearing them. So that's a really good tip.
Yes, well, the third tip is to keep your surroundings clean. So if you're in the office and you notice some of your coworkers are getting a little sick, you can sanitize doorknobs and light switches and try to keep your hands out of the community candy bowl.
Yeah, well, it's a good thing we don't have a community candy bowl here. But, you know, this is interesting because, you know, you go in somewhere for a glass of wine or something to drink after work, and there's that snack bowl, right?
Yeah.
And everybody's putting their hands in. Boy, I would love to take a culture of that and send it away and see just exactly how many germs are in that bowl because, you know, there's got to be a lot, especially this time of year.
Yeah, I think that would be pretty gnarly.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. Is that a medical term?
It is, actually.
Okay, I'm gonna use that in the next show. Well, you know, as we always do, we send the interns out on the streets of New York to see exactly what our friends from New York know about some of these health tips and what they're doing to prevent themselves from getting the cold and the flu this season. So, Courtland, you want to watch the video with me?
I would love to.
Okay, guys, roll the video, please.
So given that we're in the beginning of the cold and flu season, have you experienced any flu or cold-like symptoms?
I actually did have a mild flu a couple weeks ago.
Really?
Yeah, I went to the doctor and I got Tamiflu.
I had only the food poisoning, and that's like only symptom I had.
No, I haven't. I usually have a flu shot every year, which I think works.
I have not so far.
What precautions do you take during the flu and cold season to help you avoid getting sick?
Drink a lot of juice. Wear warm clothes. We're from Wisconsin, so wear a lot of clothes. Eat healthier, probably. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I actually always get my flu shot. Like I was telling you guys before, I'm a flu shot clinic nurse, so I've been giving flu shots to people, and I really do suggest people get them. I think an important aspect to think about is you're not just protecting yourself, but you're also protecting your loved ones. When older people or children get the flu, they get more symptoms, more severe symptoms, can have more complications. So you're not just protecting yourself, but you're protecting your family. So I like getting the flu shot. That's one of my precautions always, every season.
I think the biggest is just washing my hands with soap.
I'm like trying to eat a lot of healthy food and vitamins, and just like try to be healthy.
How often do you feel that people should wash their hands during the cold and flu season?
Definitely after going to the bathroom and after coming in contact, for example, like, you know, if they ride the subway or the bus and they touch the pole, if they're in contact with young children, things like that.
Oh, all the time. I mean,
right? Yeah.
7, 8, 9, 10 times a day, probably.
Well, every chance they get. I think I always keep Purell in my bag. I think that's a good way, especially when you're on the subway, when you're touching the rails, and a lot of people are also touching them with blowing their nose and touching it. People aren't as cautious, so just keep Purell on you. Wash your hands as often as you can.
Very often. Like I think always when you eat, you have to wash it. Yeah. So at least like I don't know, like 5 times a day, 6. Yeah. I don't know.
Do you personally use a hand sanitizer or antibacterial wash just to help you during the cold and flu season?
Yes, I do. Where we work, we have them all over the place.
Okay.
By the restrooms, the cafeteria, or whatever. So, and we have them at home, and so yeah, I'm using it all the time.
Yeah, I always use it. Yeah.
I personally don't.
Yeah, I mean, I just answered that. I love to keep it in my bag, and I think everyone should, definitely. It would prevent a lot of people from getting sick.
Well, Courtland, what do you think?
Oh, I love that video. Some really great tips. The one guy said he drinks a lot of juice, and you know, we have a vegetable juice every day, so I think that's a good tip.
Yeah, I think so. And there seems to be a lot of folks really, concerned about eating healthy at this time of year, and really staying in shape and doing some working out. And so all the way around, it was a good video.
It was a good video, and a shout out to the flu shot in that video.
Yeah, exactly right. We forgot to mention that. It's so important this time of the year, get a flu shot. You can walk into almost any pharmacy these days, no appointment necessary. The flu shot, Courtland, is so important for the young and the elderly, right? I mean, you got to really think about that. And, if you know somebody, encourage them to go get a flu shot.
Yeah, and I think it's also really great, for people who are even our age to get flu shots, because even though you may not be so susceptible to the flu, you're helping to protect those around you, like infants who aren't able to get flu shots.
Yeah, exactly right. So all the way around, great video. Our interns did a great job. The friends from New York that we interviewed, always very opinionated, did a great job as well. Well, Courtland, our favorite time of the show, Dr. Keith Flaherty is here on the set with us. And let me give you a little background on the doctor here. He is the director of the Henri and Belinda Termeer Center for Targeted Therapies at Massachusetts General Hospital. He has dedicated his career to working on this hideous disease of melanoma, and we're going to hear all about that in Targeted Therapies. I want to put things in a little bit of perspective here because there's over 800 medications in the development pipeline right now for cancer. That's a lot of work going on in the laboratories. Since the 1900s, cancer deaths rates have declined 22%. So that's good news. The rates of death are going down. Tells me we're bringing to market more sophisticated therapies. 80% of the pipeline of cancer drugs are potentially first-in-class medications. So new innovations coming to market. 73% of cancer medications in the pipeline have the potential to be personalized medicine, and that is great news. Doctor, welcome to the show. We're so excited to have you here, learn about all your work and everything that you got going on in the targeted therapy world. So, Courtland, let's jump right in.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Dr. Flaherty, again, thank you for coming in. It's really an honor to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Can we start out with you telling us a little bit about your role as the director for the Henri and Belinda Termeer Center?
Yeah, so our center is basically organized around the principle that an increasing molecular understanding of cancer has created a lot more opportunity for developing therapies that attack new points of vulnerability. And we hope in kind of creating a larger and larger toolbox that we're able to really be able to generate not just individual drug approaches, but like the HIV field, 2-drug, 3-drug cocktails, if you will, that really stymie cancer in an even more powerful way than even our best successes in this early period of targeted therapy development. We really cover the whole spectrum of cancer types. We and I'd say just about everyone involved in this type of work really don't tend to consider lung cancer and colon cancer and breast cancer as being fundamentally different. Rather, what's more important is what the molecular makeup is of the cancer. And so our group really spans the whole spectrum of cancer types, hunting for those new points of vulnerability and trying to bring very new medicines forward to test their potential utility.
That's an interesting comment you make, because when I go down the list of these 800 medications that are in the pipeline today and vaccines, I see, and I scan down through there, I see a lot indicated for lung cancer, but I don't see many on the melanoma list. And why is that? Why is it lower on the priority list?
Well, actually, part of the answer to that is the complexity of a given cancer type. So if we stick with these definitions by where a cancer starts from, lung cancer being a good starting point because it is the #1 cause of cancer death. But within lung cancer, there are probably 20 different diseases when you use a molecular definition. And so then when you say, well, how many drugs are in development for each of those subsets, sort of multiply that out, you get a lot of new therapies in the pipeline just for lung cancer. Swing over to melanoma, and we've learned that it breaks up into maybe 4 different groups. That may be a little bit of a oversimplification. So yes, it's a less common cancer in its advanced form than lung cancer, but also it bends into almost larger percent populations within that group. And so that ends up having ramifications in terms of just the number of drugs that we think we need.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Flaherty, in the most recent years, there have been many breakthroughs in therapies, and some of these breakthroughs are due to discoveries of genetic mutations. And in 2002, there was the discovery of the BRAF mutation. So can you walk our viewers through that a little bit and what that means for your research? Yeah,
so 2002 was quite an early point in the so-called targeted therapy era, which by all accounts began no sooner than, let's say, the year 2000. So if you just consider that timeline, back in those days, trying to catalog all mutations or genetic alterations in a cancer was simply not technically possible the way it is today. So in that era, scientists were going almost gene by gene, and there are thousands of genes to consider that as an underpinning of cancer. So the BRAF gene is amongst a little mini family of 3, A, B, and C RAF. And those genes encode proteins that are part of a so-called pathway inside of cells that normally passes signals from the cell surface to the interior and ends up having to do with sort of multiplication and division of cells, as well as other properties that turn out to be important in cancer formation. So the scientists at the time were honed in on these RAF genes, BRAF being the one that turned out to be the one that has mutations in about 8% of all cancers. So I would say they didn't stumble on it so much, it's that they were looking under the lamppost of a pathway that was known to be of some importance in cancer. It's just that no one had any understanding that there might actually be genetic alterations or mutations in it that were basically turning it on in a way that it couldn't be turned off.
So what other lampposts are we now looking under? Since 2002, has there been any other large discoveries that the scientists have come across?
Yeah, well, I'd say the past 5 years have really essentially dismantled the lamppost system. And now we're really looking across all genes in cells, trying to understand in even individual patients, much less populations of patients, what makes their cancer tick. Now, it turns out to be a little bit of a challenging exercise because there are thousands of genes, and you can find mutations in a good many. Let's say the average cancer patient has a few hundred mutations per cell. Not all of them are important. Some of them are just accidents and don't really relate to why that cell ever became a cancer at all. So decoding below that level, what are the key few, 3, 4, maybe 5 genetic alterations? That has been the very active exercise of the past few years' time. And it's allowing us to sort of assemble a bit of a pyramid to understand, okay, well, what is the key top of the pyramid genetic alteration that we potentially could target with a drug? And we have now a nice handful of successes of drugs that actually have shown that by targeting that primary vulnerability, you can do a lot of good. But as I've suggested, cancers are more complex than just one genetic alteration. So we know that we're still in this early era of advancing from single drug approaches to combination regimens.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the voice of the patient for a minute. So some patients have expressed frustrations over the therapies that are out there, that maybe they're not quite so effective, or certain cancer genes are resistant to these therapies. So how does this affect your research in melanoma?
Yeah, well, I think the first step, obviously it's such a shock for patients to be told they have a cancer diagnosis, and immediately they tend to feel that time is not on their side in terms of gaining lots of new knowledge, and yet we want them to get quickly up to speed. So I would say the first issue is understanding in direct conversation with cancer specialists, what do available treatments have to offer me? And just a full open conversation on that topic, because a lot of medical providers want to offer something, right? So if there's an available treatment that might have a lot of side effects and a marginal chance of being effective, let's say 10% of patients get a benefit from that treatment, well, those kinds of terms need to be right out in front, because there are many patients in that circumstance who might actually be better served by considering a therapy that may still be in clinical trials, but is developing a cumulative base of evidence that supports that it might actually be a better option, fewer side effects, maybe even higher likelihood of being effective. So this issue about whether available treatments are highly effective, which they are for certain cancer types, even the so-called chemotherapy drugs, the conventional standard treatments from the 1950s to the 1990s or so, when those came along, 90% of patients with testicular cancer, even in its an advanced form, can be cured with those treatments. So it's not one size fits all. It's a level setting discussion to understand, what do those types of treatments have to offer me with my type of cancer? Is there a basis for understanding whether there might be a more targeted or precision approach, which may require more testing? And that's oftentimes as far as we can get in the first conversation we have with patients.
Right.
So I have to ask, so you're working day in and day out with patients, you're at a research center. It seems to me like the pharmaceutical companies are on board. We're in this new frontier, right, in cancer treatment. And it seems like the diagnostic testing, is that keeping pace with the oncologists and with pharma? Because you've got this whole other group of diagnostic testing going on here.
That's right.
And we hear about Lynch and we hear about BRCA, right? But what's happening on that front, on diagnostic testing?
No, this is a huge issue. I mean, if you try to get too far down the path of focusing on therapeutic advances and leave the diagnostics out of it, you'll pretty quickly get into a scenario where we can't direct patients to these therapies without the diagnostics. You were referring to some inherited genetic alterations.
Right.
Much of the therapeutic advance of the past 10, 15 years has been understanding the mutations that happen that are not inherited, that happen just in the cancer cell. And so when you think about a family that has a spectrum of cancers within it, you can do testing off of blood, a mouth swab, this type of thing to test for these inherited predisposition syndromes. So BRCA1 and 2 for breast and ovarian cancer, Lynch for colon, APC for colon as well. These are important to consider when you're confronted with this syndrome of cancers in a family. But every cancer patient who walks in the door with a new diagnosis, there is something in their cancer cells, some set of unique features in those cells that requires testing of their tumor. And that's where the diagnostic technology has gone from research mode to practice mode just within the past handful of years now. But this is oftentimes when patients come to a center like ours, but similarly community-based practices, it's one of the immediate next steps that one has to enact, which is to say, okay, we know you've got lung cancer or colon cancer or breast cancer, but we need to know what kind you have. And we have to do more testing to figure out what your treatment options might be. So that's all diagnostics. Genetics, as you suggested, is where a lot of the early advances have been made, but there's a whole universe of evolving molecular features that don't have to do with mutations that allow us to think about deploying new treatments.
Yeah.
So can we talk about clinical trials for just a minute? There are some patients you said that would be better served to get into a clinical trial because maybe the therapies that are out there right now are not so helpful.
Right.
So how do you have that conversation with your patient and sort of try to help dispel some misconceptions about clinical trials?
Yeah, it's a long conversation, but just to kind of break it down into its components, we tend to always pace the conversation starting with, okay, what's terra firma, what's available to us, right here and now outside of a clinical trial. Let's review those options. There's still, unfortunately, a number of cancer types where the available treatments really don't offer a documented benefit, and where you'd say there isn't a lot to talk about there. But that's not true in many cancer types. So when you talk about breast cancer, colon cancer, there's real treatments that can have real impact that you have to focus on first. Then ask the question, okay, of what's emerging, is there something that is being tested in addition to one of those standard treatments, where you might be then looking to see if you can improve on the backbone of a known treatment option. Those represent quite compelling clinical trials to consider for many patients. If a patient has received a round or two of treatment and not had the success they were hoping for, oftentimes they'll then find that end of the road of available treatments, where clinical trial is at that point maybe the only way to think about pursuing a treatment that might offer some chance of hope. Of course, the thing you have to remember about clinical trials is if there's a new treatment that's being tested in a clinical trial and not yet FDA approved, by definition that means we don't fully yet understand how reliably effective it is or how reliably safe it is. And so until it crosses that line, it's still a bit of a moving target. So it takes a lot of discussion about the particulars. And I'll just finish by saying there are different phases of clinical trials. Sort of phase 1 in the early end and phase 3 as the last step before approval. And while that makes it sound like, well, we know very little to we know a lot, there are times where we go back and actually combine drugs that might actually be individually FDA approved, but if we're putting them together for the first time, that's back at square one as a phase 1 trial. So I oftentimes tell people, don't worry so much about this phase issue, just understand what are the moving parts in terms of what's being tested. And that really helps to demystify it a bit.
Yeah. So we talked about these, the long list of drugs in the pipeline, and there's got to be an equally long list of products that fell out of the pipeline somewhere along the way.
That's right.
From your perspective, do you see an opportunity to maybe resurface some of these drugs and take them back through the process in your targeted approach?
Yeah, no, it's a great insight. It is the case now that we're learning so much more about unique features that might be uncommonly found in certain cancers. And if a drug came through testing, was thought maybe to be relevant for all colon cancer patients, and a few patients responded out of 100 or so in phase 1 and phase 2 testing, that's an example of a drug that would typically be shelved to say, well, look, 3-4 benefiting patients out of 100 is just not enough to proceed, so we're going to call that a failure. Well, it's not a failure if you can figure out why those 3 or 4 responded. Because then in the sort of next wave, if you will, you'd attempt to try to treat patients only who had the same features that those 3 or 4 patients had. And this idea of focusing in on sort of the exceptional responder, if you will, the patient who gets really remarkable benefit from a treatment that's not as reliably beneficial as you'd like in a quote-unquote unselected population, but now go down to the roots of it and select those patients going forward. That's happening as we speak right now as a way of just much more efficiently navigating the whole development process, trying to get drugs to patients much more quickly.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Flaherty, a lot of things, come back to money, and there's a huge financial stress in medical research. So how is all this stress affecting research around melanoma?
Yeah, it's a major issue, frankly, across all of cancer. The U.S. is we're in a fortunate environment to have the most public funding, so taxpayer funding of research in the world, and that's still true today. But as a consequence, we have been the innovation engine, not just in terms of therapies, but diagnostics and a whole host of other supportive care elements in cancer. So that's a bit threatened to be able to keep that pipeline as robust, not just for U.S. purposes, but for the world, by having federally funded research, taxpayer-funded research on the decline, as has been the case the past 10 years roughly. It does mean that we are now in a position where we really do need to partner a bit more with the private sector in terms of really trying to align where we can our vision of how to make progress, and hope that there'll be a way for them to generate sort of the business model, if you will, while we make the case for the science and the patient in terms of how to try to connect the dots. I'd say that's actually been quite successful in many respects, but there's some really long-term projects, 10, 20-year endeavors in terms of really unraveling the science, pointing to new therapy, that I think are really potentially being sacrificed in this era where publicly funded research, which inevitably can be focused on the long term, has become harder to come by.
Interesting. So I would imagine, getting back to the clinical trials, with a targeted therapy, the population of patients to pull from into a trial is much smaller.
Yeah.
So do you see, and are you seeing today more global clinical trials? Because, from my understanding, the way it works is, a drug is approved here in the U.S. and then, country by country throughout Europe and other parts of the world. Yeah. It seems to me like there's an opportunity for either the World Health Organization and FDA to come together and say, let's look at this on a global perspective.
Yeah, certainly in the past 10 years, we've witnessed exactly as you're saying this need to rethink how it is that we execute clinical research, clinical trials, and get the therapies to patients. And I would say certainly the US and Europe as a broad entity have really partnered quite well. The regulatory authorities, the FDA and EMA, have really aligned on how to optimize and streamline clinical research and clinical trials. When you're hunting for smaller and smaller populations of patients defined by these unique molecular features, it becomes key that patients in the routine care have that sort of molecular decoding, if you will, genetic testing being an example of that, but increasingly additional methods are coming forward. To have that happen in the background so that you can know when you've got the patient in front of you who's got the type of molecular feature or mutation where that drug's actually running a 70% success rate in ongoing trials, that might look like a much more powerfully attractive option for patients to motivate them to hunt down the trial than a therapy that might be FDA approved and available but with a 10% success rate. And so this issue about really trying to go beyond cancer definitions of site of origin to the molecular features, we're shifting, but it's an issue of how much of this is research, how much of it is standard care, who bears the cost of that.
Right.
That's a big national dialogue right now.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, but I have to ask you, we have an election year approaching, and every time I turn on the TV, regardless of who I'm listening to on the stump, there's conversation about the cost of therapy.
Yeah.
And, everybody's pushing to get that lowered. On the policy making side, do you see a movement towards getting these new therapies to market faster? I mean, it seems to me like we have to accelerate that, right? I mean, we're losing patients although the statistics say in the global term, cancer death rates are going down, but we can't stop there. So do you see anything on the policy side that's going to really help accelerate getting these products to market? Yeah,
no doubt. I think, in fact, what you pointed to in one of your comments there is ultimately the solution. It's being able to go in maximally rapid speed from scientific discovery to treatment for patients narrowing the timeline, the number of patients enrolled on clinical trials to make those points, that reduced the research and development cost. And that is always what the private sector points to say, well, that's why we price the drugs the way we do, to make back the research and development cost. If we can really tighten that, not just cutting it by 50% in terms of the timeline and the total expense, but by 75, 80%, you play that forward, and that's where you can start to have a discussion to say, okay, well, if in aggregate the whole cost of getting a drug to market in cancer has been cut by that measure, then we need to have a discussion that follows to say, well, the pricing of drugs needs to go along with that as well. And we've unfortunately lived through a very inefficient era of drug development. We're just at the beginnings of this rapid, 3 to 5 year turnaround time, but already there are examples to point to.
Yeah. Well, Doc, your work is amazing. I want to thank you for taking the time to come in and talk with us today. I really do appreciate it. I want to thank our viewers for tuning in, and I'd like to thank our sponsors for making this all possible. Remember, all of our episodes can be viewed on demand at healthy0360.com, and our podcast can be found in the iTunes store. Courtland, I think you have something to say about our social media efforts.
Absolutely. We love social media, and we're all over Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. And we use the hashtag #RealStories when posting. We'd really appreciate it if you would do the same. On behalf of Dave Duplay, myself, and the entire Healthy0360 family, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again next week